My son and his wife had moved into a new house, my daughter-in-law said over the phone in a cold voice. From now on, don't interfere in our lives anymore. My son cut in and sided with her. I didn't argue. I simply answered, ended the call, and opened the old file box in the drawer. The contracts that had protected and supported them stared back at me. By tomorrow morning, not a single guarantee would remain on those pages. I'm so glad to have you here on Silent Sweet Revenge. Tell me your city and country in the comments below. Also note, this narrative incorporates fictional elements designed for storytelling and life lessons. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the wisdom inside is worth keeping. The Friday night smelled like jasmine and engine oil the way most October evenings did in our corner of Los Angeles. I was standing at the kitchen counter with the phone in my hand, scrolling to Derek's name the way I had done every Friday for the past 3 years. The routine was simple enough. I would call, ask what time worked for Sunday dinner, and spend Saturday morning deciding between pot roast and the lemon chicken Eleanor used to make. Simple. Reliable. Mine. I pressed call and listened to it ring twice before Megan picked up. Hello. Her voice carried that particular flatness I had learned to recognize over the years, the kind that wasn't quite rude, but left no room for warmth either. Megan, it's Richard. I was calling to see what time worked for Sunday. I was thinking pot roast, maybe around 6. There was a pause. Not the kind that comes from thinking. The kind that comes from having already decided. Actually, she said, we've been meaning to tell you something. We moved last week. New place out in Riverside County. More space for Cooper, better school district, the whole thing. My hand tightened around the phone. Not from anger. From the specific kind of stillness that settles in your chest when something you half expected finally arrives. You moved last week, I repeated. It was a busy time. A lot of logistics. We meant to call sooner. She hadn't meant to call at all. I could hear it in the careful, rehearsed way she delivered the explanation, each word placed like furniture in a room designed to keep me at the door. I understand, I said. Congratulations on the new place. How's Cooper settling in? He's fine. Richard, while I have you, Derek and I have been talking, and we both feel like it would be better for everyone if you gave us more space going forward. We need to be able to build our own life without feeling like there's always someone looking over our shoulder. The jasmine smell drifted through the window screen. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it couldn't reach. I see, I said. We're not trying to be hurtful. We just need our independence. Real independence. I hope you can respect that. Before I could respond, the phone shifted. Derek's voice came on louder, and with the particular confidence of a man who believed he had never needed anything from anyone. Dad, we already moved. From now on, we'd appreciate it if you stayed out of our lives. We need our space, and we need you to stop trying to be involved in everything. Megan and I are building something here, and we need to do it on our own terms. 38 years. I had coached his little league team in the rain, driven him to the emergency room at 2 a.m. when he broke his collarbone falling off a roof. He had no business being on, sat across from his college advisor, and quietly agreed to the tuition plan we both knew I couldn't fully afford. 38 years, and he was delivering this speech with the casual authority of a man canceling a subscription service. I hear you, Derek, I said. I won't bother you. It's not about bothering us, Dad. It's about boundaries, healthy boundaries. Of course, I said. Take care of yourselves. Give Cooper a hug from me. I ended the call and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. The refrigerator hummed. The dog down the block had stopped barking. The kitchen felt the same as it always had. The same yellow light above the sink. The same faint smell of the coffee I had brewed that morning, the same wooden stool where Eleanor used to sit and read her paperback novels while I cooked. Everything exactly the same, except that something had shifted underneath all of it, the way a foundation shifts before the cracks appear in the walls. I stood there for a long moment, both palms flat on the counter, looking at the window above the sink where the October dark had settled completely. Then I crossed to my desk in the corner of the living room and pulled open the bottom drawer. The tin document box was right where I had left it, gunmetal gray, slightly dented on one corner from the time I had dropped it, moving out of the old house in Burbank 12 years ago. I lifted it onto the desk and looked at it without opening it. I already knew what was inside. Every page, every figure, every date. I had organized those documents myself, with the same methodical precision I brought to every piece of medical equipment I had ever serviced. You keep records. You track what matters. You never assume that memory alone is sufficient. Derek thought I had helped them a few times. A couple of favors. The kind of thing a father does without keeping score. He had never asked to see the score. My chest felt tight. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular weight of a decision that has been approaching for a long time, finally arriving at the door. I placed my right hand on the lid of the box. By morning, not a single guarantee on those pages would still exist. The brass latch on the tin box had stiffened over the years, the way things do when they sit untouched, long enough to forget they were ever meant to be opened. I pressed the tab with my thumb, felt the familiar resistance, then the click. The lid swung back, and the smell hit me first: old paper. The faint chemical trace of ink that had dried years ago. And something underneath it, all that I could only describe as time itself. I pulled the desk lamp closer and sat down. The first document on the stack was the Vehicle Loan Assistance Agreement I had drawn up myself in September of 2023. Derek had called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that particular mixture of embarrassment and entitlement that I had come to recognize the way a mechanic recognizes an engine running slightly wrong. The dealership had approved him for a Ford Explorer, but the monthly payment was stretching him thin. He needed someone to cover the gap, $620 a month, just until the store got back on its feet. Just a few months, Dad. I've got a plan. I had heard that sentence before. I transferred the first payment the following Friday. That was 28 months ago. The total came to $17,360. I set that page aside and picked up the next one. The insurance file was thicker. I had added Derek and Megan's 2 vehicles to my own policy in January of 2024, because the combined premium under my long-term customer discount was substantially lower than what they would have paid independently. $410 a month, 24 months, $9,840. I had never once mentioned the discount to them. I had simply paid the difference and said nothing. Megan had texted me once in March of that year to ask if the insurance covered rental cars during a road trip they were planning to Sedona. I told her it did. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. The school file came next. Cooper had started at Ridgemont Academy the previous fall, a private elementary school with small class sizes, a strong arts program, and a tuition bill that arrived on the first of every month like a politely worded demand. $1,100 per month. 18 months. $19,800. Derek had framed it as a loan when he first asked. By the third month, neither of us used that word anymore. I thought about Cooper sitting in one of those classrooms. 7 years old, small hands wrapped around a pencil, learning to read maps or identify constellations or whatever it was that $11,000 a year schools taught children these days. He had his grandmother's eyes, Eleanor's eyes, wide set and serious, the kind that made you feel like the child was listening to something slightly beyond what you were actually saying. I pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and kept reading. The business bailout records took up nearly half the box. 3 separate transfers over 14 months, each one requested, during what Derek described as a temporary cash flow problem. The furniture retail industry was volatile, he explained, and inventory costs had spiked after the supply chain disruptions. He had a solid customer base, a good location in Pasadena, and a manager he trusted. He just needed a bridge. The first transfer was $8,000. The second was $11,000. The third, 14 months ago, was $12,500. $31,500 total. Each time Derek had called with the same mixture of frustration and calculation, presenting the problem as though I were a board member being briefed, rather than a father being asked for help. The remaining pages covered what I thought of as the smaller emergencies. Emergency dental work for Megan in the spring, $2,200. Veterinary surgery for their rescue dog last November, $1,400. A plumbing failure in their rental that the landlord refused to cover, $2,700. $6,500 in smaller amounts, each one treated, as though it had materialized from thin air. I laid the final page down on the desk beside the others and looked at what I had assembled. $89,000. The number sat there in the lamplight without apology or drama, the way large numbers do when they are simply true. Eleanor would have known what to say. She had always understood people in a way I never quite managed, not because I was cold, but because I operated on logic and she operated on instinct, and between the two of us we had usually arrived at the right answer. She had been gone 5 years now, taken by a stroke on a Wednesday morning in April while I was servicing an ultrasound machine at Dr. Miller's clinic across town. By the time I got to the hospital, there was nothing left to decide. Before she lost consciousness, she had squeezed my hand and said 3 words. "Watch over Derek." Not a request, a transfer of responsibility, the way you hand someone a tool and trust them to use it correctly. I had tried. God help me, I had tried. I gathered the documents back into the box in the order I had found them, replaced the lid, and pressed the latch until it clicked. Then I sat in the quiet of my living room while the neighborhood outside settled into the deep stillness of midnight, and I thought about what watching over someone actually meant. It did not mean funding a life that excluded you. It did not mean subsidizing contempt. Eleanor had asked me to watch over our son, not to disappear into the background of his convenience like a utility he had forgotten to appreciate. I stood up, carried the box back to the desk drawer, and slid it shut. Then I walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the burner. My hands were steady. My jaw was tight. Outside, the October dark pressed against every window in the house, and somewhere in Riverside County, my son and his wife were sleeping in their new home without a single thought about the foundation beneath them. By morning, I had a list of phone calls to make. None of them were going to Derek. Saturday morning arrived the way it always did in October. Thin light through the kitchen blinds, the distant sound of a leaf blower, 2 streets over the particular quiet of a neighborhood that had not yet fully woken up. I stood at this counter and measured out coffee grounds the way Eleanor had taught me, 1 heaping spoon per cup, plus 1 for the pot, and I did not once reach for the slow cooker on the shelf above the refrigerator. For 25 months, Saturday had meant something specific. It meant I was up by 6, browning meat or chopping vegetables or assembling the kind of casserole that could sit in Derek's refrigerator for 3 days without losing anything. It meant loading the passenger seat of my truck with covered dishes and driving 40 minutes across the city to a house where Megan would open the door, take the food from my hands without quite meeting my eyes, and say something like, "Cooper's napping, so keep it down," before disappearing back into whatever room she had come from. It meant spending 2 or 3 hours fixing whatever had stopped working since my last visit. A garbage disposal, a loose hinge on the back gate, a dryer vent clogged with lint, while Derek sat at the kitchen island and talked about the store's quarterly numbers with the focused enthusiasm of a man who had never once considered where his margin for error came from. This Saturday, I made 1 cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. The slow cooker stayed on the shelf. I wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat move through my palms. And I thought about the first time Derek had called asking for help. It was a Tuesday in September of 2023, 2 years and 1 month ago. I had been at Dr. Miller's clinic recalibrating a portable ultrasound unit that had started throwing error codes on the display panel when my phone buzzed against the workbench. I almost let it go to voicemail. I am glad now that I did not, though, for different reasons than I would have expected. Dad. His voice had that compressed quality it got when he was working up to something. I've got a situation with the store. Nothing I can't handle, but I need a bridge for a few months. Just to get through the inventory cycle. I asked him how much. He told me $620 a month. I did not ask him why he had not mentioned this before. I did not ask him why the store's inventory cycle required his father's retirement savings as a buffer. I asked him when he needed the first transfer, and he said Friday would be ideal, and I said I would take care of it. That was the first Friday. There were 27 more after it. What I remember most about those 25 months is not the money. The money was just numbers, figures on a bank statement, lines in my ledger digits that accumulated with the quiet persistence of interest accruing on a loan nobody had formally named. What I remember is the texture of those Saturday mornings, the way Megan's jaw tightened slightly whenever I stayed longer than 2 hours, the way Derek would walk me to the truck when I left, clapping me once on the shoulder and saying, "You're a good man, Dad," with exactly the warmth of someone who had gotten what they came for and was ready to move on to the next item on the agenda. The way Cooper would press his small face against the screen door and wave until my truck turned the corner, and how that small face was the reason I turned around and came back the following Saturday without fail. I was still thinking about Cooper's face against the screen door when the knock came at the front door. I knew the knock. 3 sharp raps evenly spaced the calling card of a man who had spent 40 years in industrial maintenance and believed that anything worth doing was worth doing at the correct interval. I opened the door, and Frank Odell was standing on my porch with his hands in the pockets of his Carhartt jacket and a look on his face that said he already knew something was wrong. Frank and I had worked together at Pacific Medical Services for 11 years before we both retired within 6 months of each other. He lived 4 blocks away in a house with a vegetable garden that he tended with the same methodical precision he had once applied to hydraulic press systems and conveyor belt diagnostics. He was not a man who asked unnecessary questions, which was the quality I valued most in him. "You look like something chewed you up and forgot to spit you out," he said. "Come in," I said. "Coffee's fresh." He followed me to the kitchen and settled into the chair across from mine. Wrapping his own hands around the mug, I slid toward him. He looked at the slow cooker on the shelf and then looked at me. And he understood immediately that the slow cooker being on the shelf on a Saturday morning meant something had changed. "Derek," he said. "Derek and Megan," I said. "They moved last week, Riverside County. I found out last night when I called to ask about Sunday dinner." Frank's jaw worked slowly, the way it did when he was processing something he considered genuinely unreasonable. "They didn't tell you they were moving. They told me when they were already gone." He set his mug down on the table with a careful, deliberate movement that told me he was choosing his next words, the way a man chooses a tool with attention to what the job actually required. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where Eleanor's rose bushes were dropping their last petals onto the dry October grass. 25 months of Saturdays. $89,000. One slow cooker sitting untouched on a shelf. Exactly what they asked me to do, I said. Frank picked his mug back up. Outside the leaf blower 2 streets over finally went quiet. Bank opens at 9 on Monday, I said. I have some paperwork to take care of. We moved out to the porch after the second cup of coffee because Frank said the morning light was better out there, which was his way of saying that whatever we were about to talk about deserved more space than a kitchen could hold. He settled into the wooden chair on the left, the one with the slightly uneven leg that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and stretched his legs out in front of him with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere else to be and no intention of pretending otherwise. The neighborhood was fully awake now. Mrs. Callahan 3 doors down was walking her retriever along the sidewalk, nodding at us as she passed. A sprinkler system kicked on across the street with a sound like a slow exhale. The October air was still carrying enough warmth to make sitting outside comfortable, the kind of morning that reminded you why people moved to Southern California in the first place, and why they stayed even when everything else about the place drove them half out of their minds. Tell me the whole thing, Frank said, from the beginning. So I did. I told him about the loan for the Explorer, the insurance policy I had folded their vehicles into the school tuition, that had quietly shifted from a loan to an expectation sometime around the 3rd month. I told him about the 3 bailouts for the store in Pasadena, each one presented with the same spreadsheet confidence and the same fundamental miscalculation about how long goodwill could be mistaken for a structural support. I told him about the Saturday mornings, the slow cooker, Megan's jaw tightening when I stayed past 2 hours, Derek's shoulder clap at the truck door. Frank listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without the reflexive affirmations that most people inserted to prove they were paying attention. He just sat with it, his eyes on the middle distance, his coffee mug balanced on his knee. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You remember what happened with my daughter Sandra?" "Some of it," I said. "You mentioned it a few years back. She did something similar. Not the money side, Sandra never had the nerve for that. But the cutting off, the deciding she was done with me on her own schedule without consulting whether I had any say in the matter." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "I kept calling, kept showing up, kept making myself available like some kind of, I don't know, like some kind of service she could pause and resume whenever it suited her." "How long did that go on?" "Through 3 years. He said it the way you say a number that still embarrasses you. 3 years before I finally stopped. And you know what happened the week after I stopped? She called." I said. "She called." He pointed at me. "Not to apologize. Not right away. First she called to ask if I still had her grandmother's china packed somewhere in my garage. But she called. And that was the beginning of something different." He paused. "Not fixed. Different. She had to learn that I wasn't going to be there by default. That my presence in her life was something she had to choose, not something she could just assume." I looked out at Eleanor's rose bushes at the edge of the yard. The last of the October blooms were hanging on deep red against the dry grass, the way Eleanor herself had hung on through things that should have finished her years earlier. "Derek isn't Sandra," I said. "No." Frank agreed. "Derek has Megan, and Megan is a different kind of problem than Sandra ever was. Sandra was selfish the way a child is selfish without real calculation behind it. What you're describing with Megan is deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway, which means she also knew exactly what she was giving up." My chest tightened around that. Not because it surprised me, but because hearing it said plainly by someone I trusted made it real in a way that my own private thoughts had not quite managed. "I keep thinking about Cooper," I said. "That's the part that keeps catching me." Frank nodded slowly. "I know. He didn't make any of these decisions. He's 7 years old, and he has his grandmother's eyes, and he presses his face against the screen door when I leave." My voice stayed level, but something behind my sternum was pulling tight like a cable under load. "Whatever I do, I can't let it land on him." "Then make sure it doesn't," Frank said simply. "There are ways to protect the boy without protecting the people who are using him as a shield." He looked at me steadily. "You're a precise man, Richard. You always have been. You don't fix a machine by replacing every part. You identify exactly what's failed, and you address that specific thing. Apply the same principle here." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, Mrs. Callahan's retriever was barking at something in a hedge 2 doors down, launching himself forward on the leash with the absolute conviction of an animal that had never learned to doubt its own instincts. "What are you going to tell Derek?" Frank asked. "Nothing," I said. "Not yet. He'll figure it out when the bills arrive." Frank made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. "And Megan?" Same answer. He nodded, looking satisfied in the way that Frank always looked satisfied when someone arrived at a logical conclusion through their own reasoning, rather than being pushed toward it. He drained the last of his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. "You want my honest opinion," he said. "I wouldn't have told you any of it otherwise." He stood up, tucking his hands back into the pockets of his Carhartt jacket, and looked at me with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had worked beside me for 11 years and knew exactly the weight I could carry. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "It's going to hurt like hell for a while, but you're doing the right thing." He walked down the porch steps and turned left toward his house 4 blocks away, his boots steady on the sidewalk, his shoulders square against the morning light. I watched him go until he was out of sight. Then I went inside and wrote down the names of every institution I needed to call on Monday morning. I had not slept well, but I had slept enough. There is a difference between those two things that only becomes clear once you have spent enough years understanding the difference between what you need and what you want. I needed 4 hours of solid rest before a decision like this one. I got 5. That was sufficient. By 7 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table with the list I had written the night before, a fresh cup of coffee, and the particular kind of clarity that comes not from having resolved something, but from having finally stopped pretending it was unresolved. The list had 6 items on it. Each one was an institution, a company, or a legal contact. None of them required Derek's permission or Megan's awareness. That was the point. I was reading through the list for the 3rd time when my phone buzzed against the table. The name on the screen was Derek. Not a call, a text message. I picked the phone up and read it. "Hey Dad, heading to Costco later if you want to come. Also, can you stop by the new place this week and take a look at the heating system? It's making a noise Megan doesn't like. And if you're going near a Whole Foods, Cooper's been asking for that organic whole milk you always get him, the kind in the glass bottle." I read it twice. Not because I had misunderstood it the first time, but because I wanted to be certain I was reading it with the same careful attention I would give any document before making a decision based on its contents. 48 hours. That was how long it had been since Derek had informed me with the measured confidence of a man who believed he held all the relevant cards, that my presence in his life was an intrusion he was no longer willing to accommodate. 48 hours, and the message sitting in my hand read like a note slipped under the door of a handyman who had not yet been informed that his services were no longer required. I set the phone face down on the table and looked at the list. Then I picked the phone back up and typed my response with the same deliberate precision I applied to every task that required accuracy over speed. "I won't be heading that way anymore, Derek." I read it back once. It said exactly what I meant, nothing more and nothing less. I pressed send and placed the phone back on the table, face up this time, and waited. The response came in 4 minutes. Not from Derek. From Megan. "Hi, Richard. Derek mentioned you might not be coming by this week. Just wanted to check, do you still have your Whole Foods membership card loaded with points? Cooper's been going through milk pretty fast, and it would really help if you could transfer the points to my account before they expire. Shouldn't take more than a minute on the app." I stared at that message for a long moment. The audacity of it was almost architectural, the way it was constructed, layer by careful layer, to make an extraordinary request sound like a minor administrative task. Shouldn't take more than a minute. As though the points had materialized independently of the years I had spent accumulating them by buying groceries for a household that had just informed me it preferred to operate without my involvement. I turned the phone face down again. This time I left it that way. Outside, a mockingbird in the oak tree at the edge of my yard was running through its repertoire with the cheerful relentlessness of a creature that had never once questioned whether its song was welcome. I listened to it for a while. Then I poured the last of the coffee into my mug and carried it out to the front porch to drink in the morning air. I was on my second sip when I heard the familiar shuffle of rubber-soled shoes on the sidewalk and looked up to find Glenn Pruitt coming up my front walk with a folded newspaper under his arm and the expression of a man who had started his morning with information he was not entirely sure what to do with. Glenn was 70 years old, a retired electrician who had lived next door for 19 years and had perfected the art of the casual visit, dropping by without calling ahead, staying exactly as long as the conversation warranted, and leaving before anyone felt obligated to offer lunch. He and Eleanor had gotten along well, bonding over a shared contempt for HOA regulations and a shared enthusiasm for the kind of tomatoes that required more effort than they were strictly worth. "Some morning, Rich?" He settled himself against the porch railing without being invited, which was simply Glenn's way. "You got a minute?" "I've got the whole morning," I said. "Coffee's inside if you want some." "I'm good." He tucked the newspaper more firmly under his arm and looked at me with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who was about to say something he had been debating whether to say since he woke up. "I saw something on Facebook this morning. Your son's page." I kept my expression neutral and took a slow sip of coffee. "What did you see?" "Big party last night. Housewarming looked like. Lot of people. Catered food, string lights in the backyard, the whole production." He paused. "Looked like a real nice place they've got out there." The mockingbird shifted its song to something with a longer, more elaborate phrase. I listened to it complete the phrase before I responded. "Sounds like they're settling in well," I said. Glenn studied me for a moment, with the careful attention of a man who had spent 4 decades reading electrical systems for faults that weren't always visible on the surface. Whatever he saw in my face, he chose not to press further. He unfolded his newspaper, glanced at the front page, and refolded it. "Anyway," he said, "just thought you might want to know." "I appreciate it, Glenn." He nodded, pushed off the railing, and headed back down the front walk toward his own house, his rubber soles quiet on the concrete. I watched him go, then looked back down at the coffee mug in my hands. A party, string lights, catered food. Every person Derek and Megan had chosen to celebrate their new beginning with, and the list had not included the man whose money had made the beginning possible. I finished my coffee. Then I went inside and opened my laptop. Monday could not come fast enough. I sat down at the desk in the corner of the living room and opened the laptop, but I did not look at the screen for a long time. String lights, catered food, a backyard full of people Derek and Megan had chosen to celebrate with. I turned that image over in my mind, the way you turn a piece of equipment in your hands before you open it, slowly, carefully, looking for the point of entry that will tell you the most about what you are dealing with. They had moved the previous weekend. That meant the party had been planned before the move, before the phone call Friday night, before Megan's flat rehearsed declaration and Derek's borrowed confidence. The guest list had been assembled, the catering had been ordered, the string lights had been purchased, and hung, all of it arranged in advance with deliberate care, and not once during any of that planning had either of them looked at the guest list and thought to add my name. That was not an oversight. Oversights happen when people are careless. Derek and Megan were not careless people. They were in their own particular way meticulous. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure in my back teeth. I pressed 2 fingers against my and held them there, breathing slowly through my nose, the way I had learned to breathe during the worst months after Eleanor died, when grief had a physical weight that settled on your chest in the early mornings and had to be managed like a chronic condition rather than cured. I thought about the last party I had attended at their house. It was Cooper's 5th birthday, 2 years ago, held at the rental on Sycamore Drive. I had arrived early to help set up the folding tables in the backyard, driven across town with a trunk full of decorations Eleanor had bought the previous Christmas for a birthday she did not live to see. Megan had directed me to a corner of the yard and handed me a balloon pump with the efficient dispatch of a project manager assigning tasks, and I had inflated 47 balloons over the course of an hour while the other guests arrived and introduced themselves to each other over the sound of Cooper shrieking with delight near the inflatable bounce house. I had not been introduced to anyone. I had inflated the balloons, eaten a slice of cake standing near the back fence, and driven home with an empty trunk and a son who texted me 2 days later to ask if I still had the receipt for Cooper's gift in case Megan wanted to exchange it. The memory sat in my chest, with the dull, specific weight of something that had been there for a long time without being examined. I had filed it away under the category of things that were unpleasant, but survivable, the way you file away a persistent ache that has not yet become urgent enough to see someone about. You keep moving. You keep showing up. You keep inflating the balloons because the alternative is leaving a 5-year-old's birthday short of decoration, and that is not something you are willing to do. But Cooper was 7 now, and this party, this housewarming with its string lights and catered platters and carefully curated guest list, had nothing to do with Cooper at all. This one had been for them. I pulled up Derek's Facebook profile on the laptop. The post was public. 43 comments, 67 likes, a photo album with 19 images. I clicked through them with the careful neutrality of a man reviewing documentation rather than his son's life. There was Derek at the center of the backyard, grinning with a bottle of craft beer in one hand and his arm around a man I did not recognize. There was Megan in a white linen dress laughing at something. Just outside the frame, her posture easy and open in a way I had never once seen her carry herself in my presence. There was Cooper in his pajamas near the end of the album, clearly retrieved from bed for a brief appearance, blinking against the lights with his grandmother's wide, serious eyes. My throat tightened. I closed the browser tab. I picked up my phone and called Frank. He answered on the second ring. "You see it," he said, which told me he had already seen it himself. "I saw it," I said. 19 photos, Frank said. I counted. 43 comments. "You doing all right?" I leaned back in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling. Eleanor had chosen the paint color in this room, a warm off-white she had called antique linen, that I had thought was indistinguishable from regular white until the afternoon light hit it at the right angle and proved me wrong. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things that required patience to verify. "I'm doing fine," I said. "You sure?" "I'm sure." I paused. "It's not the party, Frank. It's what the party means. It means they planned this. All of it. The move, the announcement, the party. It was a sequence." Frank was quiet for a moment. "A sequence," he repeated. "They didn't react, and then exclude me. They planned, and then excluded me. There's a difference." "There is," Frank said, "which means tomorrow morning isn't a reaction either." My voice was steady. My free hand resting on the desk beside the laptop was pressing hard enough against the wood that the knuckles had gone pale. "It's a response. To a plan. With a plan." "That's the right way to think about it," Frank said. I relaxed my hand deliberately, finger by finger, and looked at the 19-photo album still sitting in the browser history. Then I closed the laptop entirely. "Get some rest tonight," Frank said. "Monday's going to be a full day." "I know," I said. "Thanks for picking up." "Anytime, Rich. You know that." I ended the call and sat in the quiet of the living room while the afternoon light shifted through the windows, moving across the hardwood floor in long, slow rectangles, the way it always did on Sunday afternoons in October. Eleanor used to read in that light. She would pull her chair directly into the warmest patch of it and sit there with her paperback until the light moved on, and then she would get up and move the chair to follow it. I had never once thought to ask her why she did not simply move her chair into a permanent position that caught the light longer. Now I understood. Some things were worth the effort of following. Tomorrow morning I had 6 phone calls to make, and 1 visit to a bank on Foothill Boulevard, where a loan officer named Marcus Webb had handled my accounts for the better part of a decade. I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept without difficulty. The branch on Foothill Boulevard opened at 9, and I was in the parking lot at 8:52. I had dressed the way I dressed for anything that required precision and clarity. Dark slacks, a button-down shirt, the kind of clothes that said, "I am here to conduct business, and I have thought carefully about what that business is." The tin document box sat on the passenger seat beside me, slightly dented on one corner, containing the last of the paperwork I would need. I went in at 9 on the dot. Marcus Webb's office was the second door on the left, past the teller windows, a small room with a desk, 2 client chairs upholstered in burgundy fabric, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Marcus himself was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 20 years listening to people explain complicated situations and had learned that the most useful thing he could offer was patience. He had handled my accounts since I refinanced the house in 2015, and in that time we had developed the kind of professional relationship built on mutual competence and minimal small talk. He stood when I came in and shook my hand. "Richard, good to see you. Have a seat." I sat down and placed the tin box on the desk between us. Marcus looked at it without comment, which I appreciated. "I need to make some changes to several automated payment authorizations," I said. "I want to walk through each one and make sure the cancellations are processed correctly." "Of course." He pulled his keyboard closer. "Walk me through it." I opened the box and lifted out the first document. There's a recurring monthly transfer of $620 that I set up in September of 2023. It goes to a checking account under Derek Calloway's name. I want that authorization terminated effective immediately. Marcus typed without looking up. "That's an ACH pull authorization." "Correct. I set it up as a voluntary recurring transfer. There's no underlying loan agreement requiring it on my end. It was a personal decision I'm reversing. Understood. He typed for a moment, then looked up. Done. What's next? I set the second document on the desk. There's a monthly payment of $410 going to Pacific Coast Insurance for a multi-vehicle policy. The policy covers 2 vehicles registered to Derek and Megan Calloway. I want to remove those 2 vehicles from the policy immediately and revert billing to the base rate covering only my own vehicle. Marcus pulled up the account. I can initiate the contact with Pacific Coast from here, or you can call them directly. Either way works. Let's initiate it from here, I said. I want a paper trail through the bank. Smart. He made the annotation and moved to the next screen. Anything else tied to that policy? The roadside assistance add-on. That was added for their vehicles specifically. Remove it when the vehicles come off. Got it. He typed steadily, his expression neutral and focused. This was what I valued about Marcus. He processed information the way a good technician processes a diagnostic report. He did not editorialize. He did not ask questions that were not relevant to the task. He simply worked through the problem with the clean efficiency of someone who understood that his job was to execute decisions, not evaluate them. I placed the third document on the desk. There's an emergency expense account I set up 18 months ago. Separate savings account linked to Derek Calloway as an authorized user. Balance is currently $1,140. I want to remove his authorization and transfer the remaining balance back to my primary checking. Marcus looked up at that one. Not with surprise exactly, but with the slight pause of a man confirming he had heard correctly. Remove the authorized user and reclaim the balance. Yes. He held my gaze for a moment. Richard, I want to make sure I'm understanding the full scope here. Are we terminating all financial ties to this account holder across your portfolio? That's correct. He nodded once slowly and went back to his keyboard. I'll need you to sign a couple of forms for the authorized user removal. Standard procedure. I brought a pen, I said. He printed the forms and slid them across the desk with a pen anyway. A heavy silver ballpoint with the bank's logo on the clip. I used my own. I signed each form where indicated with the same deliberate, legible signature I had put on every important document in my adult life. Marcus collected the pages, reviewed them briefly, and set them in a folder. I also want to discuss the automated contribution to a school tuition account, I said. $1,100 a month going to Ridgemont Academy account under the name Derek Calloway. Marcus found it in the system. You want to stop that contribution? I want to redirect it, I said. Not stop it. I'll be setting up a separate education trust account for the same child, Cooper Calloway, my grandson, but the new account will be structured differently. A third-party trustee will manage disbursements. I'll be meeting with an attorney later this week to establish the trust. Once it's in place, I'll need to work with you to set up the new transfer parameters. Marcus made a note. So for now, terminate the existing contribution to Ridgemont under Derek's account and hold pending the new trust structure. Exactly. Understood. He typed the final entries, then leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the careful, respectful attention of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize a significant moment without needing it explained. Is there anything else I can help you with today? That covers it for this morning, I said. I returned the remaining documents to the tin box, pressed the latch until it clicked, and picked it up from the desk. Marcus stood and extended his hand. I shook it. I appreciate you handling this efficiently, I said. That's what I'm here for. He paused just briefly. You doing all right, Richard? It was the first personal question he had asked in the entire meeting, and he asked it quietly without pressure, leaving me full room to deflect if I chose to. "I'm doing exactly what needs to be done," I said. "That's usually enough." He nodded as though that answer satisfied him, which I suspected it did. I walked back through the bank, past the teller windows and the velvet rope and the bowl of wrapped mints on the counter that had been there for as long as I could remember. Outside, the October morning had warmed while I was inside, the kind of Southern California warmth that arrived without announcement and stayed without apology. I put the tin box on the passenger seat, settled behind the wheel, and checked my phone. There was a text from Megan sent 40 minutes ago. "Hi Richard, any chance you could come take a look at the dryer this week? Repairman quoted us $340, and honestly that seems crazy for what's probably just a belt." I placed the phone in the center console and started the engine. The drive home took 22 minutes. I spent them thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of peace. I pulled into my driveway at 10:37 and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. Not because I was uncertain about anything. Because I had learned over 67 years of being the kind of man who fixed things for a living that the transition between completing one task and beginning the next deserved at least 30 seconds of deliberate stillness. You close one system down properly before you open another. That principle had served me well in every context I had ever applied it to. I brought the tin box inside and set it on the desk. It was lighter now than it had been this morning, not in any measurable physical sense, but in the way that objects feel lighter once the decisions attached to them have been made and executed. I had felt the same thing the first time I signed Eleanor's end-of-life paperwork at the hospital, that terrible clarifying lightness of doing something irreversible that needed to be done. I made a sandwich, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and was rinsing the plate when my phone rang. Megan. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, picked up the phone, and answered it. "Saw Richard." Her voice had shifted register from the text message. The text had been breezy, almost cheerful, pitched at the frequency of someone who expected easy compliance. The voice on the phone was tighter. She had been waiting for a response that had not come, and the waiting had cost her something. "I sent you a message this morning about the dryer." "I got it," I said. "Okay, so can you come take a look? Derek thinks it's probably just the belt and you've fixed it before, so it shouldn't be a big deal." The repairman they sent out quoted us $340 just for the diagnostic, which is honestly outrageous. I walked from the kitchen to the living room and stood by the window that looked out onto the front yard. The oak tree at the edge of the property was dropping leaves onto the sidewalk in slow, unhurried intervals, each one releasing without resistance when it was ready. "Megan," I said. "What did you tell me on Friday night?" There was a pause. Not the thoughtful kind. The kind that comes when someone has been asked a question they were not prepared for because they had not expected the other person to use their own words against them. "That was about boundaries," she said. "About our living situation. This is a practical matter. I understand that you see a difference," I said. "I want to make sure I understand what you told me on Friday. You said that going forward, you needed me to stay out of your lives. Is that right?" Her breath came through the line with a sharp, controlled quality, the sound of someone recalibrating. "Richard, we're not asking you to be involved in our lives. We're asking you to fix an appliance. Those are two completely different things." "Are they?" I said. "Yes, they are. One is about family dynamics, and the other is about a broken dryer belt." I turned away from the window and looked at the desk in the corner where the tin box sat with its latch pressed shut. I remembered standing alone in the grass, blowing up dozens of party balloons, while everyone else mingled freely. I recalled the breezy morning message about grocery runs, as if their demand to cut me out had been nothing more than passing wind. "Chulurhiain," I said, and I kept my voice at the same level and temperature I used when I was explaining to a clinic administrator why a piece of equipment had failed calm, factual, without heat. What did you tell me on Friday night? The pause this time was longer. I counted 7 seconds by the clock on the bookshelf. You're serious, she said. Her voice had dropped the breezy register entirely now. What was underneath it was harder and less controlled. You're actually going to stand there and refuse to fix a dryer because of one conversation. I'm going to stand here, I said, and respect the independence you asked for, completely, on every level. That is, she stopped, started again. Do you have any idea what a repair like this costs out here? The whole point of asking family is that you don't have to pay someone $340 to come out and look at a belt. I know what repairs cost, I said. I've been paying for them for 2 years. Another pause. This one felt different, the quality of air in a room after something fragile has been dropped, and everyone is deciding whether it has broken or just bounced. So this is punishment, she said. Her voice had gone flat and cold, back to the register I recognized from Friday night, the one that had no warmth in it, because warmth had never been part of the calculation. You're punishing us for wanting our own space. My jaw tightened. My free hand pressed against the side of my thigh palm, flat fingers rigid, and I held it there for 3 full seconds before I answered her. Megan, I said. I remember very clearly what you told me on Friday night. I'm simply taking it seriously. I hope you'll do the same. Then I ended the call. I stood in the living room, holding the phone and looking at the screen where the call timer was still counting up for 1 frozen second before it registered as ended. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The first call I had ended before the other person was finished talking in, as long as I could remember. My hand was not shaking. My breathing was steady. But something behind my ribs was pulled as tight as a cable at maximum load, and I stood very still and let it hold until it eased on its own, which took about 90 seconds. Then Derek's name appeared on the screen. A call, not a text. I watched it ring once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and then I placed the phone face down on the side table and walked to the kitchen to put the kettle on. Whatever Derek had to say could wait. I had gotten very good in 67 years at distinguishing between what was urgent and what merely felt that way to people who had never had to manage either on their own. The kettle was on. The afternoon was quiet. Outside, the oak tree was still dropping leaves at its own unhurried pace, and the sidewalk below it was doing exactly what sidewalks do. It was holding. Tuesday passed, the way days pass when you are working through something methodical, not quickly, not slowly, but with the steady forward movement of a task that has been broken down into its component parts and addressed one at a time. I spent the morning at Dr. Miller's clinic on Verdugo Road, replacing a worn transducer cable on one of the examination room ultrasound units. The work was careful and absorbing, the kind that required enough attention to crowd out everything else, which was precisely why I had called Dr. Miller on Monday afternoon and told her I had availability this week if she needed anything serviced. She had given me 3 units to look at. I was grateful for all 3. I drove home in the early afternoon, made soup from a can, because I had not planned anything better, and spent 2 hours in the garage reorganizing a set of diagnostic tools that had been gradually migrating to the wrong drawers over the past several months. By the time the light outside had shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray blue of early evening, I had eaten, worked with my hands, and put something in order that had been disordered. That was enough for a Tuesday. I was in the living room with a book I was not entirely reading when my phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. A message from Frank. No text, just an image. I picked up the phone and looked at it. It was a screenshot of an Instagram post. Megan's account. I recognized the username from the one time Cooper had shown me her profile on his tablet. Proud in the uncomplicated way 7-year-olds are proud of their parents before they develop the judgment to evaluate whether the pride is warranted. The post showed the exterior of the new house in the early evening light, the kind of photograph that required either significant skill or a good phone and the right filter. The house looked large and clean and deliberate the way houses look in real estate listings when the staging team has finished their work. String lights were visible along the roofline, still up from the party. The caption read, "Built this from nothing. Just the three of us. So grateful for this beautiful life we created together." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on my knee and sat with my hands loose in my lap and looked at the bookshelf across the room where Eleanor's paperback novels still occupied the third shelf exactly as she had arranged them, alphabetical by author spines outward, the creased and sun-faded ones she had read multiple times, mixed in among the newer ones she had never gotten to. Built from nothing. $31,500 in business bailouts. $17,360 in vehicle loan assistance. $19,800 in school tuition. $9,840 in insurance premiums. $6,500 in emergency expenses. $89,000 that had passed through my accounts and into their lives as quietly and consistently as water moving through a system of pipes invisible until it stopped, essential until it was taken for granted, unremarkable, until the pressure dropped and the faucets ran dry. Nothing. My jaw was tight. The muscle along the left side of my neck had pulled into a hard line that ran from below my ear to my collarbone, and I pressed 2 fingers against it until the tension acknowledged the pressure and began very slowly to release. This was not grief. Grief was something I understood. I had lived inside it for 5 years since Eleanor died, and I knew its texture and its weight and the specific way it ambushed you in ordinary moments, like reaching for a coffee mug she had always used, or finding her handwriting on a grocery list tucked into a cookbook. This was something different. This was the particular coldness of being erased by someone who needed your erasure in order to maintain a story about themselves. I picked the phone back up and turned it face forward. I looked at the post again, the house, the string lights, the caption. Then I opened Frank's message thread and typed back, "I saw it." 3 dots appeared immediately. Frank was still awake. "You okay?" I thought about that for a moment. "Yes," I typed. "Making one more call tonight. The insurance. The insurance." I switched to the Pacific Coast Insurance customer portal and logged in with the credentials I had set up when I first added Derek and Megan's vehicles to the policy 18 months ago. The interface was straightforward. I had navigated it before when adding the roadside assistance coverage that Megan had requested, without phrasing it as a request, simply mentioning at a family dinner that it would be useful to have, and looking at me in a way that made clear who was expected to provide it. I located the policy. 2 vehicles listed as covered under the multi-driver plan, both fully covered under my long-term policyholder discount, which reduced their effective premium by 31% compared to what they would have paid independently. I selected the option to decline renewal at the end of the current policy term. The system displayed a confirmation screen. Current coverage end date November 1st, 2025. After that date, the vehicles registered to Derek and Megan Calloway would no longer be covered under this policy. They would need to obtain their own coverage independently at the standard market rate without the benefit of my discount or my 22-year claims-free history. I clicked Confirm. A second screen asked if I was certain. I was. I clicked Confirm again. The confirmation number appeared in green text at the top of the screen. I took a photograph of it with my phone for my records, then logged out of the portal and closed the browser. Outside, the neighborhood had gone fully quiet the way it did after 9 o'clock. No leaf blowers, no sprinkler systems, no dogs registering complaints about things in hedges. Just the low, ambient hum of a city that never went entirely silent, but knew at least how to lower its voice. I set the phone on the arm of the chair and picked up my book again. I found my place and read the same paragraph 3 times before it finally settled into meaning. Built from nothing. I turned the page. That night I slept better than I had in months, and in the morning I had one more name on my list to call. The name on my list that I had not yet called was Dr. Patricia Miller, and I called her Wednesday morning at 8:15 from the kitchen table while my coffee was still too hot to drink. I told her I had availability through the rest of the month and asked if there was anything at the clinic that needed attention beyond the 3 units I had already serviced. She said there was the portable X-ray machine in examination room 4 had been producing images with a faint banding artifact across the lower third of the frame, and the automatic calibration cycle did not appear to be resolving it. She had been putting off calling a full-service technician because the quotes she had received were in the range of $2,000, and she suspected the problem was simpler than that. I told her I would come Thursday morning and take a look. I arrived at the clinic on Verdugo Road at 8:50, which was 10 minutes before the first patients were scheduled, and 40 minutes before Dr. Miller's administrative assistant, a methodical woman named Brenda, who ran the front office with the precision of an air traffic controller, had finished her opening checklist. I let myself in through the side entrance with the key I had carried on my ring for 6 years and went directly to examination room 4. The portable X-ray unit was a model I had worked on before a Carastream DRX Revolution Compact, and well-engineered, the kind of equipment that rarely failed dramatically and frequently failed quietly. I ran the diagnostic cycle, watched the banding artifact reproduce itself in the same location both times, and had a reasonable hypothesis within the first 15 minutes. The flat panel detector housing had developed a microfracture along the lower edge seal, allowing a small but consistent amount of ambient light contamination to affect the lower portion of the imaging field. It was not a catastrophic failure. It was the kind of slow, incremental degradation that happened when a piece of equipment was used carefully, but not carefully enough, and nobody had noticed, because the artifact was subtle enough to ignore until it became impossible to. I had the housing resealed and the calibration cycle rerun by 11:30. The test images came back clean. Dr. Miller appeared in the doorway of examination room 4 at 11:45, still in her white coat from the morning's patient rounds, a paper coffee cup in one hand, and reading glasses pushed up into her dark hair. She was 55 years old and had the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had spent 3 decades making consequential decisions under time pressure, and had long since stopped apologizing for either the pace or the directness. "You fixed it," she said, looking at the clean test image on the unit's display screen. "Microfracture in the detector housing," I said. "Light contamination, resealed and recalibrated." She looked at the image for another moment, then at me. "What do I owe you?" Parts were $12. Labor at my standard rate. She shook her head with the slight smile of someone who had had this conversation with me before, and knew I consistently undercharged. "Richard, your standard rate has not changed in 4 years. It reflects what the work is worth to me," I said. "Not what the market thinks it's worth." She sat down in the patient chair and crossed her ankles and looked at me with the frank, unhurried attention she gave to things she was genuinely curious about. "You seem different today," she said. "From Tuesday. You came in Tuesday and you were—" She paused, choosing carefully. "Contained. Like a pressure system that hadn't decided whether to rain yet, I set my tools back in the case in the order I always returned them, each one in its designated slot, and considered how much of the truth was relevant. Some things at home have shifted, I said. I've been making some adjustments. Good adjustments or hard adjustments? Both, I said. Usually the same thing. She nodded as though that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Cooper doing all right? I haven't seen him in here since his checkup in June. My hands slowed for just a fraction of a second over the tool case before continuing their work. He's doing fine, I said. Settling into a new school. Good. She stood straightening her coat. I have 2 more units I'd like you to look at before the end of the month. The ultrasound in room 2 has been running warm, and the EKG machine in the front examination room is due for its annual calibration. I can do room 2 next Thursday, I said. EKG the week after. Perfect. She started toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Richard, whatever adjustments you're making, they look like they're suiting you. I closed the tool case latch with a firm click. I appreciate that, Dr. Miller. She left her footsteps quick and purposeful down the hallway. I stood in the examination room for a moment in the particular quiet of a medical space between patients' antiseptic and coffee and the low hum of equipment doing what it was designed to do without drama or complaint. It struck me not for the first time that I felt more genuinely valued in this room than I had felt in my son's house in the better part of 2 years. Dr. Miller paid my invoices on time, said thank you without being prompted, and noticed when something was different about me. She noticed. I drove home on the 2 on 10 with the windows down, because the October afternoon was warm enough to make air conditioning feel like an imposition, and I thought about the week behind me and the week ahead. I had canceled the automated transfers. I had removed the vehicles from the insurance policy. I had told Megan exactly what I meant and ended the call before she was finished responding. I had slept well 2 nights in a row. The adjustments were suiting me. Dr. Miller was right about that. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home and bought what I actually wanted for dinner: a good ribeye steak, a bunch of asparagus, a bottle of Worcestershire sauce, and a pint of vanilla ice cream for no reason other than that I wanted it. I paid with my own card, carried my own bag, and loaded my own truck. No list from anyone else. No additions for a household that had informed me my involvement was unwelcome. Just a ribeye and asparagus and ice cream and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who was eating exactly what he chose. When I got home, there was a notification on my phone. The insurance portal had sent a confirmation email for the policy non-renewal. Coverage for the 2 vehicles registered to Derek and Megan Calloway would end November 1st, 2025. They would receive their own notification within 5 business days. I put the steak in the refrigerator and the ice cream in the freezer, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and stood for a moment looking out the window above it at the backyard, where Eleanor's roses were still holding their last blooms against the October light. The third name on my list I thought was Attorney Carol Stanton, but that call could wait until Saturday. Friday evening arrived quietly, the way Friday evenings do when you no longer have anywhere specific to be at the end of the week. I had eaten early, cleaned the kitchen, and was sitting in the living room with the television on at low volume, a nature documentary about migratory birds that I was watching with approximately 30% of my attention when my phone rang at 7:43. Frank. I muted the television and answered. Evening? You still on Facebook, he said. No preamble, no greeting beyond the word itself. When Frank opened a conversation that way, it meant he had information he was not sure how to deliver, and had decided that directness was kinder than build-up. I have an account, I said. I don't use it much. Pull up Megan's profile, he said. The photo albums. I switched to speakerphone and opened the app on my phone, navigating to Megan's profile with the slightly effortful unfamiliarity of someone who visited a platform rarely enough that the interface was never quite where he expected it to be. I found her photo albums and clicked through to the family collection. I scrolled down. The most recent album was titled Our New Chapter and contained 41 photographs taken at and around the new house in Riverside County. I had seen 19 of them already when Glenn had mentioned the housewarming. These were different interior shots, lifestyle photographs, the kind that required arrangement and intention. Cooper at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice. Megan in the backyard with a coffee mug. Derek on the front porch with his arms crossed and a satisfied expression that reminded me with a sharpness I had not anticipated of the way his grandfather used to stand in front of a completed project. There were no photographs of me anywhere in the album. I scrolled back further to the albums that predated the move. The birthday collections, the holiday photographs, the miscellaneous family moments that Megan had been curating on this platform for the past 4 years. I looked through 3 of them with the careful, methodical attention I gave to anything I needed to understand completely before responding to it. I was not in any of them. Not the Christmas photographs from 2023 where I had driven 40 minutes across the city with Eleanor's good china serving dish full of the green bean casserole she had made every December for 31 years. Not the photograph of Cooper's 5th birthday party that had been taken near the bounce house which I had located and paid for because Derek had forgotten to book entertainment until 4 days before the party. Not the photograph of Cooper on his first day of kindergarten, for which I had taken the morning off from a clinic job and stood on the sidewalk outside the school with a disposable camera, because I still preferred them to phone cameras for moments I wanted to remember correctly. In every photograph where I should have been present, the frame had been carefully composed to exclude me, or the image had been cropped, or an alternative shot had been selected, one where I was not visible. It was not the work of an afternoon. It was the work of months, possibly years, of deliberate curation. My throat closed around something hard and sharp that had no name I was willing to give it. Rich. Frank's voice came through the speaker, quiet and steady. "You still there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice came out level, which surprised me because the thing in my throat was pressing upward with a force I had not felt since the morning the hospital called about Eleanor, and I had stood in the parking lot of Dr. Miller's clinic with my phone in my hand and understood in the space between one breath and the next that the shape of my life had permanently changed. "I'm sorry," Frank said. Just that. No elaboration, no advice, no pivot to practical action. Just the 2 words said with the weight of a man who understood that some things did not benefit from being surrounded by additional language. I set the phone on the arm of the chair and stood up. I walked to the hallway bookshelf, the tall one Eleanor had insisted on buying at an estate sale in Pasadena 12 years ago. The one I had complained about carrying up the front steps and then quietly come to love because it held everything she had ever wanted to display, and I looked at the second shelf from the top where the photograph albums lived. 6 of them, thick and chronological, their spines labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. The early years, Derek growing up, our family. I pulled the 3rd one from the shelf and carried it back to the living room. I sat down and opened it on my knee. Derek, at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish he had caught at the lake near my brother's cabin in Oregon. Derek, at 12, standing in front of his first bicycle, the one I had assembled in the garage on Christmas Eve with a manual that had been translated from Korean by someone who had an incomplete grasp of either language. Derek, at 17, in his cap and gown at his high school graduation, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, her face turned up toward his, with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that looking at it now pressed against my sternum like a hand. Eleanor in every photograph. Her laugh, her posture, her particular way of leaning slightly toward the people she loved. Present in every frame, never curated out, never cropped away. Cooper at 2 years old sitting in my lap in the backyard of the old house, both of us looking at something outside the frame. His small hand wrapped around my index finger, the way infants do with the absolute unthinking trust of a creature who has not yet learned that trust is a decision. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against them hard and held it there until the burning receded enough to continue. The phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. Frank again, this time a text. "Call me when you're ready. No rush." I looked at the photograph of Cooper and me in the backyard for a long time. Then I closed the album, carefully returned it to its place on the hallway shelf, and went back to the living room where the nature documentary was still running silently on the television. The birds still moving across the screen in their ancient, indifferent patterns. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a different notification, not Frank. The caller ID read Cooper Calloway, which was the contact name I had set up when Derek had given the boy his first tablet 2 Christmases ago, and Cooper had called me 7 times in the first hour to show me different things he had found on it. The name on the screen made my chest pull tight in an entirely different direction than the album had. I picked up the phone and answered it. The voice on the other end was small and clear, the way 7-year-old voices are when they have not yet learned to modulate themselves for the benefit of whoever is listening. Cooper had always spoken with a directness that reminded me of Eleanor, not the content of what he said, but the quality of his attention when he said it, the sense that he was fully present in the conversation rather than half managing it from a distance. I had been called Grandpa by this child for 7 years. The word had arrived naturally without instruction, the way children absorb language from the texture of the world around them. He had said it first at 18 months, sitting in his high chair, at the kitchen table of the Sycamore Drive rental, pointing at me with the imperious confidence of a toddler who had recently discovered that things had names and that naming them was a form of power. Eleanor had laughed until she had to set her coffee cup down. "Hey, buddy," I said. My voice came out exactly as I intended it, warm, unhurried, carrying nothing of the album or the missing photographs, or the 7 years of Saturdays, or the thing that had been pressed against my sternum since Frank had said those 2 words an hour ago. Whatever was happening between me and Derek and Megan was not Cooper's weight to carry. It would never be his weight to carry. "What's going on?" "I have a question about my science project," he said. "We're doing the solar system, and my teacher said each planet has to have 3 facts, but I already have 3 facts for Jupiter, and I want to put more because Jupiter is the best one." "Jupiter is an excellent choice," I said. "What 3 facts do you have so far?" He recited them with the careful precision of a child who had memorized something and was pleased about it. Jupiter was the largest planet. It had 79 moons, and its great red spot was a storm that had been going on for hundreds of years. All 3 facts were correct. I told him so, which made him exhale with the satisfaction of someone whose research has been independently verified. "Can I put more than 3?" he asked. "Check with your teacher first," I said. "But if she says yes, Jupiter also has the shortest day of any planet in the solar system. It rotates so fast that a day there is less than 10 Earth hours long." "That's so fast," Cooper said in the tone of someone receiving information that has personally delighted him. "It is," I said. "Very fast for a very large planet." We talked about Jupiter for 4 more minutes. He told me his teacher's name was Miss Alvarez and that she had a gecko named Pretzel who lived in a tank near the reading corner, and that Pretzel had escaped once and been found in someone's backpack, which Cooper considered the funniest thing that had ever happened in an educational setting. I agreed that it was extremely funny. He laughed, and the sound of it moved through the phone and into the living room and settled somewhere in my chest, with a warmth that the last hour had not entirely managed to extinguish. Then there was a brief pause, the kind that happens when a 7-year-old has finished the thing they called about and is deciding whether the conversation is over. "Hey, buddy," I said, keeping my voice exactly the same. Easy, unhurried. "Did you happen to get a card in the mail last week? Something that came in the post for you?" A beat of silence. "A card like a birthday card?" "Something like that," I said. "I don't think so." His voice carried the uncomplicated certainty of a child reporting a fact rather than managing information. "I didn't get anything in the mail. Mom usually puts my mail on my desk when I get something." "That's okay," I said. "I just wanted to check. It's nothing important." "Tell me more about Pretzel. Did Miss Alvarez ever figure out how he got the backpack open?" Cooper launched back into the gecko story with full enthusiasm, and I listened to every word of it, making the appropriate sounds of interest and amusement at the appropriate moments, and my voice did not change, and my breathing did not change, and nothing in the timbre of my end of the conversation would have told anyone listening that something had just shifted in my understanding of what Megan was willing to do. The card had arrived. She had received it. She had set it aside. Cooper had never seen it. He was still talking when Megan's voice came from somewhere in the background, not into the phone, just audible, telling him it was time to get ready for bed. Cooper said one moment, "Mom," with the automatic negotiating tone of a child who knew the request was non-negotiable, but registered protest as a matter of principle. "I gotta go," he told me. "I know," I said. "Jupiter's great red spot. Don't forget." "I won't forget," he said. "Bye, Richard." I held the phone against my ear for 3 full seconds after the call ended, listening to the silence on the line. Then I set the phone down on the arm of the chair and pressed both palms flat against my thighs and stared at the muted television screen where the migratory birds were still moving in their ancient formations across a sky so blue it looked artificial. Bye, Richard. Not Grandpa. Not the word he had arrived at himself at 18 months, pointing across a kitchen table with a toddler's absolute authority. A different word now. A name, not a title. The distance between those two things was not measurable in any unit I had ever worked with, but it was real and it was deliberate, and it had been introduced into my grandson's vocabulary by someone who understood exactly what she was doing and had done it anyway. My right hand had curled into a fist against my thigh without my deciding to make it. I looked at it as though it belonged to someone else, then opened it finger by finger and laid it flat again. I picked up the phone and sent Frank a text. 2 words, "Call Stanton." His response came in under a minute. "Saturday morning, first thing," I typed back. I set the phone down and looked at the bookshelf in the hallway, where the album I had returned to its place sat between its companions on Eleanor's shelf, exactly where it belonged. Cooper's card was in a drawer somewhere in a house in Riverside County, unopened and undelivered, sitting in the dark, with the handwriting of a grandfather who had taken the time to write something real inside it. That was the last thing I thought about before I went to bed, and it was enough to make everything that came next feel not like anger, but like clarity. Carol Stanton's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Brand Boulevard in Glendale, 12 minutes from my house by surface streets, and 15 by freeway, depending on the time of day. I had been referred to her 3 years ago by a colleague of Dr. Miller's, who needed estate planning advice after his father died, intestate, leaving a moderately complex asset situation and a family with strongly divergent opinions about how to resolve it. Carol had handled that situation with what I was told was characteristic efficiency and zero tolerance for procedural delay. That description had been enough for me to put her card in my wallet, where it had stayed until Friday night, when I sent Frank 2 words and went to bed. She met me in her office at 9 on Saturday morning, which told me something about her before she said a word. Attorneys who meet clients at 9 on a Saturday are attorneys who understand that their clients' problems do not observe business hours, and who have decided that being useful matters more than being convenient. Carol Stanton was 58 years old with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the particular directness of someone who had spent 3 decades watching people arrive in her office in various states of crisis and had learned that the kindest thing she could offer them was clarity. She shook my hand firmly, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and sat down without preamble. "Frank Odell called me last night," she said. "He gave me a general outline. I pulled the relevant California statutes this morning, so we wouldn't spend your time on basics. Tell me what you want to accomplish," I told her. I explained Cooper, 7 years old, currently enrolled at Ridgemont Academy, the son of my son Derek and his wife Megan. I explained that I wanted to establish a dedicated education trust fund for Cooper that would provide for his schooling from the current moment through his college years, but that I wanted the fund structured in a way that kept the assets entirely outside Derek and Megan's control. No access to the principal, no discretion over disbursements, no ability to redirect funds for any purpose other than Cooper's direct educational expenses. Carol listened without interrupting her pen, moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she looked up. "What you're describing is a straightforward, irrevocable education trust," she said. "Under California law, you transfer assets into the trust name a third-party trustee, an institution, or a professional fiduciary, not a family member, and specify the disbursement conditions. In your case, disbursements go directly to the educational institution. The school receives payment. Cooper's parents receive nothing." "That's exactly right," I said. "The trust can cover tuition, mandatory fees, books, and approved educational materials. If you want to extend it to room and board for college, we add that language now." She made a note. "Do you want to include a provision for private secondary school as well, or only higher education?" "Both," I said. "He's 7. I don't know what his path looks like yet, but I want the fund to be flexible enough to cover it." "Sensible." She wrote for a moment. "Asset amount." I had thought about this on the drive over. I had also thought about it to some degree for the past several days, during the quiet spaces between clinic work and grocery runs and conversations with Frank. The number I had arrived at was not impulsive. $120,000, I said. Initial contribution, with the option to add to the principal annually up to a specified cap. Carol's pen paused for exactly 1 second, not from surprise, I thought, but from the professional habit of confirming she had heard a significant figure correctly. 120,000, initial. Yes, she wrote it down. That covers approximately 10 years of private school tuition at current LA market rates, or 4 years of mid-tier university with room and board, or some combination. Given the flexibility provisions we're building in, the trustee will have discretion to allocate appropriately as Cooper's needs develop. That's what I want, I said. She looked up from the legal pad. I want to make sure you understand the irrevocable nature of this instrument. Once the trust is funded and executed, you cannot reclaim those assets. They belong to the trust for Cooper's benefit until the purpose is fulfilled, or the trust terminates according to its own provisions. I understand, I said. That's why I'm doing it this way. Something shifted slightly in Carol's expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition. She had, I suspected, seen enough of what people did with their money and their families to understand what the structure of this particular request was saying without being told directly. "Who do you want as trustee?" she asked. "I can recommend several professional fiduciary firms we work with regularly. They're bonded regulated by the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and they operate entirely independently of the beneficiary's family." "Whoever you recommend," I said. "I trust your judgment." She recommended a firm called Pacific Fiduciary Partners, which had managed educational trusts for her clients for 11 years, without a single contested disbursement. I told her that sounded exactly right. We spent the next 40 minutes going through the trust document section by section. Carol explained each provision in plain language before asking whether I approved it, which I appreciated. She was not condescending about it, simply thorough in the way that good technicians are thorough when explaining a repair to a client who has a right to understand what is being done to their equipment. By the time we reached the signature pages, I had a complete and accurate understanding of every word I was signing. I signed with my own pen. 7 pages each, one witnessed by Carol's paralegal, a young woman named Jennifer, who came in, witnessed efficiently, and left without comment. Carol collected the pages, squared them against the desk, and looked at me. "Pacific Fiduciary will be in touch within 3 business days to complete the asset transfer and open the trust account. After that, the fund is active." "Thank you," I said. "One more thing." She folded her hands on the desk. "The child's current school, Ridgemont Academy. Do you want me to contact them directly to establish the new payment protocol, or would you prefer to handle that yourself?" I thought about Derek receiving the next tuition invoice and finding no payment waiting from my account. I thought about the phone call that would follow. "Contact them directly," I said. "Make sure the transition is clean." Carol nodded, making the final note on her legal pad. "It will be." I shook her hand, collected my copy of the executed documents, and rode the elevator down to the lobby. Outside on Brand Boulevard, the Saturday morning foot traffic was moving at its weekend pace, unhurried, purposeful, the ordinary rhythm of people conducting the ordinary business of their lives. I put the documents in the passenger seat beside the tin box, which I had brought out of habit and had not needed to open once. When I got home, Frank was sitting on my front porch with 2 cups of coffee. "How'd it go?" he said, handing me one. "It's done," I said. He nodded, satisfied in the way Frank was always satisfied when something had been handled correctly. We drank our coffee on the porch without saying much else, and the morning moved around us at its own pace, and somewhere in Riverside County a phone was about to ring with news that no one in that house was prepared to receive. Sunday passed without incident, which was its own kind of gift. I went to the farmer's market on foot. In the morning, bought tomatoes and a loaf of sourdough, and a bunch of dahlias that I put in the blue ceramic vase Eleanor had kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, and spent the afternoon doing a full inventory of my tool cases, checking calibration on the precision instruments, replacing worn tips on 2 diagnostic probes, organizing the replacement parts drawer in the garage that had been accumulating components in the wrong sections since July. By the time evening came, I had eaten a good meal, put my tools in order, and gone to bed at a reasonable hour, with nothing unresolved pressing against the underside of my thoughts. Monday brought Tyler Brooks. He called at 10:45 in the morning, while I was at the kitchen table going through the Pacific Fiduciary Partners paperwork that had arrived by email the previous Friday, and that I had been reviewing section by section, with the same methodical attention I gave to any technical document. The number on my phone was one I did not immediately recognize with a Pasadena area code. I answered it. "Mr. Calloway." The voice was young, mid-30s at most, with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who had rehearsed an opening and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not fully prepared him for the actual moment. This is Tyler Brooks. I work at Callaway Home Interiors, Derek's store. I don't know if you remember me. We met about 2 years ago when you came in after closing. You signed some paperwork at the back table. I was the one who brought you the water. I did remember him. A tall young man with close-cropped hair and the careful movements of someone who took pride in his work, without making a performance of it. He had brought me a glass of water, without being asked, which was the kind of detail that stayed with you. I remember you, Tyler, I said. How can I help you? Another pause, longer this time. I'm not sure I should be calling. I've been going back and forth about it since last week. But I saw something, and I kept thinking about it, and I felt like you should know that someone saw it. What you did. I mean what you did for the store. I set the Pacific fiduciary paperwork aside and gave the call my full attention. Tell me what you saw. He told me. Last Thursday, Derek had brought a potential new wholesale partner into the store, a regional furniture distributor out of San Bernardino, who was evaluating Callaway Home Interiors as a possible retail account. Derek had walked the man through the showroom with the confident ease of someone completely at home in his own success, explaining the store's history, its customer base, its track record of navigating difficult market conditions. Tyler had been working the floor close enough to hear most of the conversation without being part of it. He told this guy that he built the store from nothing, Tyler said. Those were the exact words. Built it from nothing, never took outside money, weathered the supply chain problems through good management and smart inventory decisions. A pause. I was standing behind the credenza display when he said it. I had to act like I was straightening the cushions on a sectional because I didn't know what else to do with my face. My free hand was resting on the kitchen table, palm flat. I pressed it down slowly and held it there. I appreciate you telling me that, Tyler. I was there that night, he said, and his voice had steadied now, the rehearsed quality replaced by something more direct. The night you came in. Derek had called me and asked me to stay late because he said he had a meeting and he needed someone to lock up after. I didn't know what the meeting was. I was in the back doing inventory when you came in, and I could see through the office window. He stopped. You had a folder. You signed something. And then Derek shook your hand and you left, and he came back into the showroom and he looked relieved, like a man who'd just gotten a reprieve. $31,500 in 3 transfers, $8,000, $11,000, $12,500. Each one accompanied by a phone call in which my son explained his situation with the fluency of a man who had learned that a certain kind of confidence could substitute for accountability if deployed correctly. I know it's not my business, Tyler said. I know you're his father, and whatever happens between the two of you is between the two of you. I thought you should know that somebody in that building saw it. What you actually did. Not the version he tells other people. My throat felt tight in a way that was different from the album or the birthday card or the word Richard spoken in Cooper's clear, unwitting voice. This was something else. This was the particular pressure that comes when an act of private sacrifice is witnessed by an unexpected stranger, and the witnessing makes it more real than it had been before. Not because it needed to be more real, but because solitude has a way of making you doubt your own version of events. Thank you, Tyler, I said. That means more than you know. I hope things work out, he said simply. Whatever that looks like. We ended the call, and I sat at the kitchen table with the Pacific fiduciary paperwork in front of me and the Pasadena number still on my recent calls list and the quiet of the Monday morning kitchen around me. And I thought about the night I had walked into Callaway Home Interiors after closing time with a folder of documents and signed my name to a $12,500 transfer while a young man in the back room watched through an office window and brought me a glass of water without being asked. Some things are witnessed even when you believe they are not. That was worth knowing. My phone buzzed. An automated notification from the vehicle loan servicer, the company that held the financing agreement on Derek's Ford Explorer. The message was brief and impersonal, generated by a system that did not know or care about the context behind the numbers it was tracking. The October payment had been received 14 days late. A late fee of $62 had been assessed and added to the outstanding balance. It was the first payment Derek had ever made on that loan without my money arriving first. $62. A small number by any measure. But the direction it pointed in was not small at all. I set the phone down and went back to the Pacific fiduciary paperwork, reading the next section with the same careful attention I had been giving it before Tyler Brooks called. The afternoon had its work to do, and so did I. The 1st of November arrived on a Saturday, which meant the Pacific Coast insurance coverage on Derek and Megan's 2 vehicles ended at midnight on a Friday, quietly without ceremony, the way most consequential things end when they have been properly prepared for in advance. I knew the exact moment it happened, because I had set a reminder on my phone, not out of any desire to mark the occasion, but because I am the kind of man who tracks completion dates the way I track maintenance schedules. You note when a system goes offline. You record it. Then you move on to the next item. I moved on. The following week unfolded the way November weeks do in Los Angeles, warm enough during the day to make you forget. It was autumn, cool enough in the evenings to remind you. I worked 2 days at Dr. Miller's clinic, serviced the ultrasound unit in examination room 2 that had been running warm, and spent a Thursday afternoon helping Frank replace a section of fence in his backyard that had been leaning at an increasingly optimistic angle since September. We worked without talking much, which was one of the things I valued most about Frank's company. He understood that productive silence was its own form of conversation. It was Frank who first told me about the Facebook posts. He called on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November around 7 while I was eating dinner. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, which was Frank's way of preparing me for information he considered significant. "Derek's been posting." "What kind of posting?" "The kind that tells you things are not going well at the new house." I heard him shifting in his chair. First one was last Saturday, asking if anyone knew a good HVAC company in Riverside County that wasn't, quote, highway robbery. Second one was Monday. Vague complaints about unexpected expenses and how adulting is no joke. Third one was this morning, asking if anyone had experience disputing insurance premium increases. I set my fork down and thought about that for a moment. Derek had always used social media the way some people use a confessional. Publicly, somewhat compulsively, with the implicit expectation that disclosure would generate absolution in the form of sympathetic comments. It was not a habit I had ever understood, but I had learned to read it as an indicator of his internal state in the way that certain error codes on a diagnostic screen indicated the internal state of a machine. 3 posts in 8 days meant the pressure was building faster than he had expected. The HVAC post got 42 comments, Frank said. Mostly people recommending companies. One person said Central Air Repair in Riverside County ran them $6,200 last spring. Derek replied with a crying, laughing emoji. "What's the actual repair running him?" "Based on the comments, he's getting probably between $4,500 and $5,500. He hasn't posted a final number." I picked my fork back up and finished the last of my dinner roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, a meal I had made for myself, without consulting anyone's preferences but my own. "What about the insurance?" "Pacific Coast sent them a new quote for independent coverage," Frank said. "I know, because Derek posted a screenshot of the quote number, not the full document, just the total with the caption, 'Anyone else feel like insurance companies are running a criminal enterprise?'" The number visible in the screenshot was $814 a month. I did the arithmetic without needing to write it down. My long-term policyholder discount had been running their combined vehicles at $410 per month. Without that discount, without my 22-year claims-free history attached to the policy, without the multi-vehicle rate that applied when their cars were bundled with mine, they were looking at nearly double the premium. That was not an insurance company running a criminal enterprise. That was the standard market rate for two vehicles registered to drivers in their mid-30s with a shorter claims history and no loyalty discount. That was what independence actually cost. And the car payment, I asked. Second late fee showed up in his feed indirectly. He made a comment on someone else's post about bank fees that said something like, "Tell me about it, October nearly broke us." Frank paused. He doesn't know I can see his posts. We have a mutual friend from his college days who he hasn't unfollowed. I nodded, though Frank couldn't see it. How's Megan handling it? Her account's been quiet, Frank said. No posts since the Instagram one from October, which with someone who posts as regularly as she does is its own kind of signal. I thought about that. Megan's silence on social media was not grief or reflection. It was management, the strategic withholding of information from a curated audience until the narrative could be reframed in her favor. She was not processing. She was waiting for the right angle. Rich. Frank's voice dropped slightly. There's one more thing. Glenn told me he saw Derek's car parked outside your house Tuesday afternoon. You weren't home. I had been at Dr. Miller's clinic on Tuesday. How long was it there? Glenn said about 20 minutes. Derek didn't get out of the car the whole time, just sat in the driveway and then drove away. I let that settle. My son had driven 45 minutes from Riverside County, parked in my driveway, and sat in his car for 20 minutes without knocking on the door. Then he had driven away. I did not know what to make of that precisely, but I knew what it felt like. It felt like a man who had come to say something and had not yet found the words or the courage or the version of events that would allow him to say it without admitting things he was not ready to admit. He would come back. When the words arrived, or when the situation became urgent enough to force them out regardless of their readiness, he would come back. Thanks for telling me, I said. You want me to come over Saturday? Frank asked. I'll call you, I said. There may be more to tell by then. We ended the call, and I sat at the kitchen table with my empty plate and the quiet November evening around me, and I thought about a man sitting in a driveway for 20 minutes and then driving away, and about how much courage it takes to knock on a door when you know you have no good explanation for what waits on the other side of it. My phone lit up with a new notification. Megan Calloway was calling. She had not waited for Derek to find his words after all. I answered on the second ring. Why are you doing this to us? Megan's voice was tight and controlled, the kind of controlled that takes effort to maintain. The insurance, the school payments, all of it. Is this your way of punishing us for moving? I said nothing for 3 seconds, long enough for her to hear that I was not going to be rushed. I haven't punished anyone, I said. I've simply stopped doing things I was never obligated to do in the first place. You have a grandson. Her voice cracked slightly on the word, then recovered. Do you even think about what this does to Cooper? The school called Derek today. Did you know that they said the payment structure has changed and they need to speak with a family representative? Cooper doesn't understand why everything is suddenly different. My jaw tightened. I pressed 2 fingers against the kitchen counter and held them there. Cooper's education is fully funded, I said. He will not miss a single day of school. The structure changed. The commitment did not. A sharp intake of breath. You went behind our backs. You asked me to stay out of your lives, I said. I'm honoring that request on every level except one. Cooper did not make that request. He never will. This is manipulation, she said, her voice rising. You're using money to control us, exactly what you always. Megan. My voice was quiet and completely level. What did you tell me on the first Friday of October? Silence on the line. 4 full seconds. I told you we needed our independence, she said finally, each word arriving separately like stones being placed. Then you have it, I said. Completely. On every level you asked for. I ended the call. 3 days later, I heard tires on my driveway. I recognized the sound of Derek's engine before I even looked up from my book. Before I reveal what happened when they unexpectedly pulled into my driveway, comment "stand tall" or drop the number 100 below, so I know you're still riding along with me. Also, please keep in mind, the upcoming section contains creative dramatizations crafted for storytelling purposes. If that format isn't for you, feel free to step away from the video right here. I heard the tires before I saw the headlights. It was a Saturday evening in the middle of November, the kind of evening that arrives in Los Angeles with a particular quality of stillness. The marine layer coming in from the coast, the temperature dropping in a way that made the air feel serious. I had been in the living room with a book I was genuinely reading for once, not half watching, not managing a background awareness of my phone, just reading. The fire in the small gas fireplace was doing what it was supposed to do, and the house smelled like the cedar candle Eleanor had always kept on the mantelpiece that I had finally gotten around to burning. I recognized the engine. 20 years of listening to Derek's cars, the one he drove in high school, the one I helped him buy the year he graduated college, the two after that, had given me an involuntary familiarity with the particular note of his engine at low speed. I set my book down and walked to the front door. Derek was already coming up the porch steps, Megan 2 paces behind him. The Ford Explorer was in my driveway with the check engine light glowing amber through the windshield. Neither of them had called ahead. I looked at my son's face. He had not slept well. I could see it in the set of his jaw and the slight puffiness around his eyes and the way he was carrying his shoulders forward and tight. The posture of a man who had been bracing for something long enough that the bracing had become involuntary. Megan stood slightly behind him, and to his left, her arms already crossed against her chest. Her expression arranged into something that was meant to look certain, but had the quality of certainty that requires maintenance. You're really doing this? Derek's voice carried the particular strain of a man who had rehearsed anger and arrived somewhere closer to exhaustion. Just cutting us off like we're nobody. I stood in the doorway with both hands loose at my sides. The cedar candle smell drifted out past me into the November air. I haven't cut you off, I said. I gave you exactly what you asked for. We asked for space. His jaw was tight, the muscle along it working visibly. Not this. You asked me to stay out of your lives. I kept my voice at the same register I used when explaining a repair to a clinic administrator, calm, precise, without heat. I took that seriously. I thought you would want me to. You knew what we meant. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he stopped and pressed his mouth shut, and looked away for a moment toward the oak tree at the edge of the yard where the mockingbird had gone quiet. When he looked back, something in his expression had shifted. The rehearsed anger had slipped further, and what was underneath it was less controlled and considerably more complicated. You knew we didn't mean all of it. Derek, I said his name quietly, the way I had said it when he was 12 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and spent an hour constructing an explanation that technically contained no lies, but bore no useful relationship to the truth. You said what you meant. Megan said it clearly. You're entitled to mean it. Megan stepped forward, her weight shifting onto her front foot, her arms tightening across her chest. You want to punish us? Just say so. Don't dress it up as respect. I looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger. With the particular attention I gave to things I wanted to understand completely before responding to them. Megan had always been a person who believed that naming a dynamic gave her control over it, that if she could identify what someone was doing, she could redirect it. It was a useful skill in the right circumstances. This was not those circumstances. I looked back at my son. Your mother made me promise to take care of you, I said. I kept that promise for 38 years. You decided you were finished with it. I paused, letting that settle the way a diagnosis settles, not harshly, but completely. I'm respecting that decision, Derek. Not punishing it. Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His shoulders dropped forward slightly the way a structure settles when the load-bearing element is removed. Not collapsing, just finding a new level, recalibrating to the actual weight it was carrying without the additional support it had stopped acknowledging years ago. I watched his face move through something I could not name precisely, and did not try to. Whatever he was understanding in that moment was his to understand. I had said what I had to say from this doorway, and I had meant all of it, and there was nothing left that required my voice. Glenn Pruitt's porch light clicked on across the street. The small mechanical sound of it carried clearly in the November quiet. Drive safe, I said. That check engine light has been on for a while. In this temperature, it's worth getting looked at before you're back on the freeway.
Megan's jaw tightened. She looked at Derek. Derek looked at his shoes, the good leather ones he wore when he wanted to feel prepared. And then he looked at me, and in his face I saw something I had not seen there in a long time. Not contrition exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of a reckoning with the distance between the version of events he had been carrying and the version that had been true all along. He picked up his keys from his jacket pocket, even though he had not put them down. We'll talk, he said. It came out more quietly than anything else he had said tonight. Almost a question. When you're ready, I said. I'll be here. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The sound of the Explorer's engine turned over a slight hesitation before it caught the way engines hesitate when the check engine light has been on long enough that the underlying problem has become real rather than theoretical. Then it reversed out of the driveway, and the headlights swept across the living room window, and the sound faded down the block in the direction of the freeway. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the doorknob and listened until I could not hear it anymore. The cedar candle was still burning on the mantelpiece. The fire was still doing what it was supposed to do. The book was open on the arm of the chair where I had left it, holding my place without being asked. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The water boiled. I made the tea and carried it to the back porch and sat down in the November dark and drank it slowly, and that was enough. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour, the particular quiet that settles over residential streets after 9 o'clock when the dinner dishes have been put away and the televisions have been turned to lower volumes and the dogs have come inside. I sat with my mug and listened to it, this ordinary quiet, and thought about how long it had been since I had sat in my own backyard at night without the background pressure of something undone. A call I had not returned, a repair I had promised to schedule, a person I had been bending myself toward the shape of without ever quite becoming it. The pressure was gone. In its place was simply the night and the tea and the mockingbird in the oak tree that had apparently decided 11 o'clock was a reasonable time to practice its repertoire. I sat outside until the tea was gone and the air had cooled enough to make the cardigan insufficient. Then I went inside, rinsed the mug, and went to bed.
I slept without interruption until 6:45, which was, I noted, the best night's sleep I had recorded since the spring. December arrived the way Eleanor always said good things, arrived quietly without announcing itself, asking only that you be present enough to notice. The first week brought a cold front that dropped the overnight temperature into the low 40s, which in Los Angeles constituted a meteorological event, significant enough to prompt people to dig out coats they had not touched since the previous winter. I found my good wool overcoat in the back of the closet, checked its pockets out of habit, and discovered a folded grocery list in Eleanor's handwriting, Buttergood coffee, the kind of orange marmalade that takes 2 stores to find. I stood in the closet doorway for a moment with the list in my hand, and then I refolded it carefully and put it back in the pocket where I had found it. Some things you carry without explaining why. Frank came by on a Saturday morning with coffee and the information that Derek had sold one of the vehicles and was restructuring the store's supplier contracts. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without editorializing. I nodded, and we drank our coffee and watched a pair of mockingbirds argue over territory in the oak tree, and neither of us said anything more about it. Frank stayed for an hour and a half, and we talked about his vegetable garden and a problem he was having with his water heater and a documentary he had watched about the construction of the Hoover Dam, and at no point did either of us feel the need to return to the subject of my son. That was friendship of a particular and useful kind. I was grateful for it. The tin box was in the bottom drawer of my desk. I had not opened it since October. Glenn Pruitt stopped me on the sidewalk one Tuesday morning when I was carrying the recycling bins back from the curb. He said he had seen Derek's car in the neighborhood once or twice in the past few weeks, driving slowly past, but not stopping. I thanked him for telling me. Glenn nodded, picked up his own newspaper from the driveway, and went back inside without elaborating, which was the correct instinct. If Derek was driving past, he was working something out. People work things out at their own pace, or they don't. I had said what I had to say from my own front porch on a Saturday evening in November. Whatever he did with it was his to decide. I was not waiting for anything. Cooper called on a Thursday afternoon in December, wanting to tell me that Jupiter had won. Miss Alvarez had given him full marks, and let him include the extra fact about the rotation speed. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, "she put a star sticker on it." I closed my eyes for 1 second. "That's exactly right, buddy," I said. "You earned that star." We talked for 11 minutes about the solar system and Pretzel, the gecko, and a boy in his class named Oliver, who could burp the alphabet, which Cooper considered a talent worthy of serious respect. I agreed. He laughed, and the sound of it moved through the phone the way it always had, settling somewhere in my chest where it belonged. I did not ask him about the birthday card. I did not ask him what word his mother had taught him to use for me, or whether it had changed back, or why. He had called me Grandpa without hesitation, without the slight self-consciousness of a child repeating an instruction. He had called me Grandpa the way he had called me Grandpa at 18 months, pointing across a kitchen table with a toddler's absolute certainty that the world contained this person and this word, and that they belonged together. That was enough. More than enough. After we hung up, I went to my desk, took the tin box from the bottom drawer, and placed it on the shelf beside Eleanor's photograph albums. Not hidden, not open, just there, part of the house, part of the record, part of what had happened and what it had cost and what it had made possible. The documents inside it were real. The numbers were real. The 25 months of Saturdays and the $89,000 and the 47 balloons inflated at the edge of a party where no one thought to introduce me. All of it was real, and all of it was finished, and finished things deserved to be placed somewhere visible, rather than buried in the dark of a bottom drawer, as though they were something to be ashamed of. Eleanor would have approved of that, I thought. She had always believed that the things that cost you the most deserved the most honest accounting. I went out to the back porch with a fresh cup of tea. The December light was long and gold across the yard, moving slowly through Eleanor's rose bushes, the way light moves through things it has learned to love. The last of the autumn blooms had gone weeks ago, but the canes were still standing bare and patient, and entirely themselves waiting for the season to turn the way things that know how to wait always do. I thought about Eleanor finding her chair in the afternoon light, and moving it to follow the warmth, and how I had never thought to ask her why she did not simply find a permanent position. Now I understood it completely. Some warmth is worth following. Some light requires the effort of moving toward it again and again in whatever season you find yourself. I sat down and let the December air settle around me. Somewhere in Riverside County, a family was making adjustments. Bills were being paid on time or not quite on time. Supplier contracts were being renegotiated. A check engine light had presumably been seen to or ignored or worried over in the particular way that problems get worried over when there is no longer anyone in the background to simply handle them. Those were not my calculations to make anymore. They were not my systems to maintain. My system was here. This porch, this tea, this yard, with its bare rose canes and its arguing mockingbirds, and the shelf inside where a tin box sat beside photograph albums in Eleanor's handwriting. My phone was quiet on the table beside me. I did not think about anything in particular. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. I have carried this story for a long time. Now I am setting it down. I was not a perfect father. I gave too much, said too little, and called it love when sometimes it was just fear of being cut off from the people I had spent my life building toward. Don't be like me. Don't wait until the box is full before you decide your dignity is worth protecting. I believe the way I believe in God, without needing to say it loudly, that genuine family justice begins not in courtrooms, but in the quiet moment when you finally stop accepting less than you deserve. These revenge stories, family, never make the headlines. They happen in kitchens and driveways, in the soft click of a door closing. But they are real, and they matter. In my personal opinion, love without boundaries is not love. It is a subsidy. And no one respects what they never had to earn. This is what family justice truly looks like. This is what revenge stories family sounds like when it belongs to an ordinary man with a tin box and 67 years of patience. If this story moved, you leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Wise Revenge for more stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If that is not the journey you are looking for today, no hard feelings, find the content that speaks to your heart.